Imagine turning on the news and hearing that the whole country is buzzing about something that happened behind the closed doors of the most famous palace in the world. For weeks, people had been whispering, but now it was finally out. The king, who had been so strong for so long, was stepping back from his royal duties. Everyone knew he had been sick, but no one knew just how serious it was until now. The palace was shifting, and all the power and responsibility was moving to the prince and his wife. That was the headline, but it wasn't the real story. The real story, the one that had everyone gasping, was a single sentence. It was handwritten at the very bottom of a very important document, and that sentence did something nobody expected. It completely shut the queen out of having any say in the big decisions of the monarchy from now on. From what we're hearing, she had no idea it was coming, not a clue. The document was already signed and sealed before she even knew what hit her. If you've been watching the royal family at all, you know the king has been trying to show everyone that everything was fine. We saw the pictures of him working at his desk looking busy. We heard the statements saying his treatment wasn't slowing him down. It all looked so calm and steady on the outside, but behind all those fancy curtains and closed doors, things were falling apart. Meetings were being canceled. Big ceremonies were being cut short. And the prince was quietly taking on more and more of his father's public duties. It was like watching a slow change happen, but nobody was saying it out loud. What we are learning now is that the breaking point came during a practice for a big state ceremony. The king showed up, determined to get through it like he always did, but the people there said he just couldn't keep up. His face went pale, his answers got shorter, he seemed to lose his focus. Eventually, the room had to be cleared and his doctors were called in. They were blunt. They told him that if he didn't stop pushing himself so hard, he was going to undo all the progress he had made. He needed to give up most of his responsibilities immediately and get ready for a much longer break than anyone had ever said in public. That news led to a secret emergency meeting at the palace. The prince, his wife, the king's sister, and a small group of constitutional advisors were all called in without any warning. Nobody told them why they were coming. Before we get into what happened inside that room, I have to ask you a question. Are you happy the king chose his son and his daughter-in-law over the queen? Let me know in the comments below. And if you think the queen has held on to power for way too long, don't just sit there. Like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single thing that happens next, because this story is far from over. So picture this, they're all sitting around this big heavy table. In the center there is a sealed folder. On the front it says the royal continuity and succession order. At first, the prince thinks it's just about canceling a few events. His wife thinks it's just a temporary fix. But then the king opens the document and explains what it really means. It transfers everything to the prince. We're talking about state audiences, big palace appointments, planning ceremonies, and even the long-term direction of the monarchy itself. It's all going directly to him. And then, the king turns to his daughter-in-law. Under this new order, she would take on responsibilities that are normally expected of a reigning queen. State banquets, diplomatic receptions, the whole public program of the royal household. Basically, the visible duties that tell the whole country and the world who is at the very center of royal life. It was a huge deal. Now she didn't answer right away. Honestly, I get it. Accepting a role like that changes how every single appearance in the future is seen. It's one thing to support your husband. It's another thing entirely to step into a position that makes you look like you are already the queen, just waiting for your turn. Even the prince pushed back. He told his father that people might think he forced this transition. He was worried it would look like ambition, not necessity. But the king was clear. He said the decision was his and that protecting the monarchy couldn't mean pretending his strength hadn't changed. He was trying to shield them from the blame. But here's where it gets really weird. Before the meeting could continue, the king's sister placed a second folder on the table. Inside were confidential notes from members of the queen's household. And these weren't just casual emails. They were plans. Plans for how the queen could keep her authority if the king stepped back. Plans for how her office could keep influencing ceremonies, appointments, and the palace program. Plans for how the prince's control could be treated as temporary, even if the king remained away for months. The prince read the first page twice. His wife stayed completely still. The implications were impossible to ignore. While the king was struggling to maintain his duties, the queen's household was already discussing how to keep power in her hands, and neither the prince nor his wife had been invited into those conversations. The king hadn't approved them. His sister had found them before the plan could go any further. The language in those notes was careful. Nothing sounded openly rebellious. Nobody used the word power, but every single line pointed in the same direction. The queen's office had been preparing for the king's absence before the prince was even told how serious that absence might become. The proposal described an advisory arrangement based at the queen's own residence. It would allow her office to review ceremonial plans, recommend changes to the royal diary, and stay involved in state banquets and public appearances. One paragraph actually suggested that the prince's expanded authority should be described as temporary, even if the king stayed away for months. That one sentence changed the entire room. The prince asked who wrote it. He turned to another page and pointed to a list of names: senior members of the queen's office, private secretaries, household advisors. The king read the names in silence. He hadn't approved the meeting. He hadn't requested the proposal, and he definitely hadn't been told that his wife's household was already discussing how to preserve influence after he stepped back. The prince's wife's attention moved to the margins of the document. There were handwritten comments next to the proposals. One recommended that major ceremonial decisions should require consultation with the queen's office. Another warned against allowing the prince's palace to become the only center of authority during the king's recovery. The message underneath all that polite wording was unmistakable. The prince could carry the burden, but the queen intended to keep a hand on the controls. The king's sister explained that the papers had reached her after a senior aide became uneasy. The concern was framed as continuity, stability, experience. Palace language can make almost anything sound harmless. But the king closed the folder and asked the question everyone was thinking. Did the queen know about this? His sister said the discussions had taken place through her household, but the documents didn't show how much she had personally approved. The prince looked toward the door, ready to confront her right there. The king stopped him. He said this couldn't become a hallway fight, not with staff moving through the palace and reporters watching every change in the royal schedule. The queen would be summoned privately and given a chance to explain. The meeting broke for 20 minutes. The prince walked into an adjoining room overlooking the gardens. His anger hadn't gone away. It had settled into something colder. His wife followed him and reminded him that the papers were dangerous because they looked reasonable. A public accusation would allow the queen's office to deny everything and paint the prince as impatient for the crown. He understood that made it worse. When the queen finally entered the room, the king was seated at the head of the table and kept the folder closed. The prince stood near the fireplace. His wife sat directly opposite the chair prepared for the queen. Nobody raised their voice. The silence did enough. The king asked her directly whether her household had discussed an advisory council operating from her residence after his withdrawal. The queen paused and said responsible staff had considered several possibilities. She described it as preparation, not ambition. She argued that a monarchy facing uncertainty couldn't afford to discard experience. She had stood beside the king through years of public pressure. She understood the diplomatic calendar, the ceremonial machinery, the personalities inside the royal household. Removing her office from every important decision wouldn't create stability. It would create disruption. Then she made her request. The order should be amended. She proposed a formal position allowing her to retain influence over state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronages, and the public program. The prince would manage constitutional business. His wife could represent the crown beside him. But the queen's household would remain involved whenever tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were concerned. It sounded like a compromise. It wasn't. The prince's wife asked one question: who would make the final decision when the prince and the queen disagreed? The queen answered that the king's wishes should guide them. But that was the problem. The king's absence was the entire reason this arrangement existed. Yet the queen's proposal still depended on him settling disputes from private rooms while he recovered. The burden would come back through calls, competing instructions, and appeals for intervention. The king's sister opened the folder and slid one page toward the king. It described the prince's authority as reversible. That one word ended the discussion. The king told the queen that no amendment would be made that created a second court or weakened the heir's authority. The queen's expression changed. She turned to the prince and asked if this was what he wanted. The prince answered that he hadn't written the order. The king had. The queen left without accepting the decision. The door closed softly behind her, but nobody mistook calm for surrender. The king then asked the constitutional advisor the question everyone had been avoiding. Could the queen's household challenge the order after it was signed? The advisor looked at the final page and said there was one way to make sure they never could. He explained that a transfer of duties could be challenged through interpretation. A household might claim consultation rights. An aide might delay an appointment. A disputed instruction could be returned for clarification. None of those moves would overturn the prince's authority, but each could slow it, weaken it, and force the king back into the struggle he was trying to escape. The king understood this was no longer about whether his son could carry the workload. It was about whether anyone would be allowed to obstruct him while pretending to protect the crown. The prince moved away from the fireplace and sat opposite his father. He told the king that he wouldn't accept authority built on public humiliation. He wouldn't appear before the country as though illness had become an opportunity. If the announcement went forward, it had to preserve the king's dignity. The king nodded. Stepping aside wasn't surrender. He said it was a choice made before weakness allowed others to choose for him. The prince's wife asked how the transition would be presented. Her concern was clarity. The The country couldn't be shown one arrangement while the palace operated under another. If the prince was expected to lead, the public program had to reflect it. If she was expected to assume the queen's visible duties, no private office could quietly revise her decisions. The king's sister watched the king closely. He had spent years balancing affection, duty, history, and guilt. Now every compromise led back to the same problem. The queen wanted recognition for standing beside him. The prince needed unquestioned authority as heir. His wife needed protection from accusations that she had taken something not hers. The monarchy needed one voice. Only one of those needs could govern the order. The advisors began revising the document. Clauses granting consultation rights to the queen's household were removed. State audiences would pass directly to the prince. Senior palace appointments would require his approval. Long-term planning would move under his office. His wife would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the royal household. The king's sister would remain the bridge, not the ruler, not the rival, the witness. For nearly an hour, the king read every line. He asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then months, then longer than expected. The answers became less comfortable each time. A temporary arrangement couldn't remain temporary forever simply because no one wished to name what came next. The crown couldn't live inside a pause. The king reached the final page. The signature line waited beneath the royal seal. Beside it lay the fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. The prince expected him to sign. His wife expected another delay. His sister noticed his hand move away from the signature and toward the blank space below the last clause. He began to write slowly. No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the queen's household. That one sentence changed everything. The prince read it once, then again. The order was no longer just a medical arrangement. It was a barrier. The king hadn't merely transferred responsibility to his son. He had blocked the office most likely to contest how that responsibility would be used. His daughter-in-law looked toward his sister. His sister gave no sign of surprise, but her stillness revealed that she understood the scale of what had happened. The king had chosen institutional certainty over private peace, and he had done it in his own handwriting. That mattered. Type language could be blamed on advisors. Legal phrasing could be described as routine. A handwritten sentence from the king could not be dismissed as an administrative misunderstanding. The king signed beneath the sentence and signed his name. The prince placed his hand on the document but didn't pick it up. For a few seconds, father and son remained on opposite sides of the table, aware that the paper between them had changed more than the royal diary. It had changed the center of power. A secretary entered, sealed the copies, and asked where the first should be delivered. The king answered without hesitation, the queen's residence. She received it before the announcement was even drafted. She turned the pages, reached the handwritten line, and stopped. Then she called for her staff. The meeting at the palace had ended. The fight over what the king had signed was only beginning. At the queen's residence, her staff expected anger. What they saw instead was control. She placed the copied order on a table and asked each advisor to read the handwritten sentence. No one spoke. The words were too direct. They left no space for negotiation, no quiet route back into palace decisions, and no chance to claim that the prince's authority remained dependent on her approval. The queen asked whether the sentence could be softened before the announcement. Her legal advisor answered carefully. The king had written it himself. The seal had been applied. The king's sister had witnessed the signature. Any attempt to alter the wording would require the king to reopen the order. The queen understood the problem. The king had closed the door before she could reach it. Her private secretary suggested that she appear beside him anyway. A united image might preserve influence that the document had removed. The queen rejected the idea, standing beneath palace cameras while the prince and his wife were presented as the new center of the monarchy would look like consent. Worse, it would make her a witness to her own exclusion. She would not give them that picture. Across London, the palace moved with unusual speed. Communications officers drafted the statement. Ceremonial staff measured positions in the throne room. Security teams revised arrival plans. Government representatives in Westminster received restricted notice that the king would address the country regarding the future conduct of royal duties. The language was chosen with care. The king was not abdicating. The prince was not being crowned. His wife was not being declared queen. Yet every practical detail pointed toward the same reality. Authority was moving. Public responsibility was moving. The visible weight of the crown was moving with it. The palace statement would call it continuity. The room would call it succession. The king insisted on appearing first. Advisors wanted a written announcement released through official channels, but he refused to let illness speak for him. He would look into the cameras, explain the decision, and make clear that his son had not demanded it. That mattered to him more than anyone realized. The prince had spent years preparing to inherit the crown, but preparation was not desire. The king knew how quickly the public could turn duty into ambition. One photograph of the prince near the throne, one poorly chosen phrase, one suggestion that his wife looked too comfortable, and the transition could be recast as a family takeover. So the king would carry the blame. He approved the short address stating that his recovery required a reduction in duties. He would confirm that the prince was assuming responsibility for state audiences, senior appointments, and strategic planning. He would name his daughter-in-law as the person overseeing major ceremonial functions and the household's public program. Then he added a line the advisors had not prepared. The future must not wait for pride to admit what duty already knows. No one asked them to remove it. At the queen's residence, she received the final schedule. Her arrival time had been left blank. A place remained available near the king during the opening statement, but no role had been assigned to her afterward. She could attend as his wife. She could not participate as a decision-maker. The distinction cut deeper than any public insult. The queen sent one final message to the palace. She asked whether the king would reconsider the restriction on her household if she appeared beside him. The reply came 20 minutes later. The order stood as signed. The queen canceled her car. Outside the palace, broadcasters began live coverage. Crowds gathered beyond the gates. Newsrooms across the United Kingdom cleared their schedules. The first images showed senior officials entering through a side entrance, followed by the king's sister, then the prince and his wife. The queen was missing. Rumors spread immediately. Some claimed illness. Others suggested a private disagreement. Palace officials repeated the same phrase, a family matter. Inside, the king waited in a private room with the original order beside him. The prince arrived first. His wife followed. The king's sister stood by the window, watching the courtyard below fill with cameras. The king looked tired, but his voice remained steady. He told the prince that the announcement would change the public understanding of their relationship. From that moment, every decision would be examined for signs of conflict. Every absence would become a theory. Every appearance would be treated as a declaration. The prince answered that he would honor the reign already in progress. His wife said nothing. She was looking at the two ceremonial chairs beyond the open doors. One bore the prince's place, the other bore hers. A palace aide entered and confirmed that the queen would not attend. The king closed his eyes briefly, then gave the order to begin. The cameras went live, the palace doors opened, and before the king spoke a single word, Britain saw who had chosen to stand beside the future and who had chosen to stay away. The king entered the prepared room alone. For several seconds, he stood behind the lectern without speaking. The cameras had found the strain around his eyes. No palace statement could hide it. He looked determined, but the effort required to remain there was visible. Then he began. He told the country that duty sometimes demanded a person recognize the difference between endurance and service. Continuing at any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose it to uncertainty. His recovery required distance from the daily weight of the crown, and the institution required leadership that could act without hesitation. He named the prince. The words were measured, but their meaning traveled through London, Westminster, and newsrooms. Following the address, the prince would assume responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the long-range direction of the royal household. The arrangement would begin immediately. Then the king named his daughter-in-law. She would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the crown. Her role would not be decorative. She would stand beside the prince whenever the monarchy needed to show the country who now carried its public burden. The room remained silent. The king did not mention the queen. That omission struck harder than any criticism could have done. He thanked those who had supported him during his treatment. He spoke of continuity, family, and the future, but the woman who had stood beside him through his reign was absent from both the room and the transfer of authority. At her residence, the queen watched the address with two staff members. She did not speak when the prince's name was announced. She did not move when his wife's new responsibilities were listed. Only when the king finished, without naming any continuing role for her, did she reach for the copy of the order again. The handwritten sentence waited near the royal seal. Nothing had changed. Back at the palace, the king stepped away from the lectern. The prince entered through the side doors. He did not smile. He approached his father, bowed his head, and promised to honor the reign the king had begun. The moment was carefully controlled. The emotion was not. The king placed one hand on the prince's arm, then released it quickly, as though holding on longer might reveal too much. His wife joined them a few steps later. She wore no crown, no tiara, and no symbol suggesting celebration. Her expression carried the weight of the decision more than any speech. The king's sister watched from the edge of the room. She had seen constitutional moments presented as pageantry before. This was different. There were no cheers inside the palace, no music, no sense of victory, only a family trying to turn a private collapse and confidence into a public image of order. Then the king left. Cameras remained. The prince and his wife turned toward the throne room where the two ceremonial chairs had been positioned beneath the royal insignia. They began walking together slowly enough for every broadcaster to capture the image across the United Kingdom. The symbolism was immediate. This was not a coronation, but it looked like the beginning of something that could not easily be reversed. The prince stopped before the first chair. His wife stood beside the second. Neither sat at once. For one suspended moment, they remained standing, aware that the country was watching them inherit responsibility before it inherited a new monarch. Then the prince took his place. His wife followed. The pictures spread across television screens and phones within minutes. Commentators debated whether the palace had crossed an invisible constitutional line. Supporters described it as necessary stability. Critics questioned how temporary the transfer could be when the ceremony had been designed to present the prince and his wife as the monarchy's next center. One question dominated every broadcast: where was the queen? Palace officials repeated that her absence concerned a private family matter. The phrase satisfied no one. Reporters outside the palace had already learned that her car had been canceled before the address. Others discovered that no future ceremonial role for her appeared in the public briefing. The explanation began to unravel inside her residence. She ordered the television switched off. She had expected the king to reduce his schedule. She had not expected him to make the prince's authority visible in front of the world. She had certainly not expected his wife to assume duties the queen believed should remain attached to her position. Her title had not been removed, her influence had. After the cameras left, a private secretary handed the prince the signed order rather than the public copy. He examined the final page and noticed something he had missed during the meeting. The king had placed the handwritten restriction directly above the royal seal. Anyone attempting to challenge the prince would have to pass that sentence before reaching the king's signature. It was not an afterthought, it was the point. The prince carried the original order into a smaller audience room after the cameras had gone. The noise outside the palace continued, but inside the building felt emptied of ceremony. The king was waiting near the window. His daughter-in-law stood beside a table covered with briefing papers. The king's sister remained by the door holding the second sealed folder no one had yet discussed. The prince placed the order before his father. He asked one question: was the handwritten restriction truly necessary? The king did not answer at once. He looked at the sentence above the seal, the one line that had transformed the medical arrangement into a boundary. Then he admitted what the public statement had left unsaid. His doctors had forced him to reduce the workload. The queen's private preparations had forced him to decide where authority ended. Without that sentence, every decision could have become a negotiation. An appointment made by the prince could have been questioned at her residence. A state banquet planned by his wife could have been revised through private messages. A ceremonial invitation could have been delayed until the king intervened. The king would have stepped away in public while continuing to settle disputes in private. That was not recovery. That was another form of captivity. The king told the prince that he had spent too many years believing personal loyalty could be balanced against institutional clarity. This time there could be no blurred line, no rival office, no second court operating through friendship, access, or habit. The prince listened without interrupting. The anger he had carried earlier began to change. His father had not written the restriction to embarrass the queen. He had written it because he knew how quickly uncertainty could become control. His daughter-in-law understood the cost more quietly. The king had protected their authority, but in doing so he had exposed the fracture inside his own household. The public would see a careful transition. The family would remember the argument behind it. She finally moved from the door. She said the sentence would be studied for years because it revealed the moment the king stopped trying to satisfy everyone. As king, he had chosen one line of command. As a husband, he had accepted the consequence. At her residence, the queen was reaching the same conclusion. Her title remained, her staff remained, her rooms, engagements, and private charities remained. Yet the machinery that gave those things influence had shifted away from her. Decisions would now leave the prince's office. Ceremonial instructions would carry his wife's approval. Appeals to the king would no longer reopen what had been settled. The queen had not lost everything. She had lost the part that mattered most, the ability to shape what happened next. By evening, the image of the prince and his wife beneath the royal insignia had traveled across Britain. Supporters called it stability. Critics called it a soft transfer. Palace officials refused both descriptions. They repeated that the king remained king and that the arrangement protected continuity. But symbols speak when statements refuse to. 2 chairs had been prepared, 2 names had been announced, 1 household had been excluded. The king asked the prince for one final promise. The transition must not become a campaign against the queen. No public retaliation, no deliberate humiliation, no attempt to erase her from his reign. The prince agreed, but the promise carried a limit. Respect would not mean surrendering authority. His wife supported that line. The queen would be treated with dignity, but she would not be permitted to reopen decisions through private pressure. That was the settlement. Cold, clear, final. And then the king's sister placed the second sealed folder on the table. The king looked at it and asked whether it could wait. She said it could not. The cover carried a short title: Queen's Household, Privileges and Residences After the Transition. Inside were instructions concerning staff access, ceremonial invitations, and the royal properties the queen could continue using while the king remained away from public life. One page concerned her residence, another concerned the main palace. But the final page carried a handwritten note beside the queen's name. It identified the exact date her unrestricted palace access could end, and it had been approved before the throne room announcement began. The queen had not seen it, the prince had not seen it, and when the king's sister opened that final page, even the king appeared unprepared for what had already been authorized. The decision carried a deadline measured not in years but in days. That document and the single residence the queen could be ordered to leave first is where the next story begins.